The sea boiled beneath him. Waves shattered into white spray as a B-25 Mitchell screamed just meters above the waterline, engines howling in agony. The pilot's hands trembled on the control yoke, not from fear, but from the raw violence unleashed through his aircraft's nose. 8 50-caliber machine guns, roaring together like a single voice of vengeance. Tracer rounds carved a molten path across the deck of a Japanese freighter. Metal tore, men scattered. The pilot didn't pull up. He pressed harder, teeth clenched, riding the recoil like a surfer atop a wave of fire. In seconds, the ship's bridge erupted in flame. This wasn't bombing from the clouds. This was something new, something Japan had never seen and never expected. It was 1943, in the steaming waters of the Bismarck Sea. For months, American crews had been dying trying to halt Japanese convoys resupplying New Guinea. Bombing runs from high altitude barely scratched the enemy. Precision was impossible through tropical storms, flak, and smoke. The Japanese simply repaired their ships, sent more men, and kept the war alive. But now, in the choking haze of salt and cordite, a new sound echoed over the Pacific, a low, grinding, relentless thunder. The B-25, once just a medium bomber, had become a weapon of pure aggression. Its nose no longer carried glass and a bombardier. Instead, it carried steel, barrels, and raw intent. No one had ordered this transformation at first. It wasn't part of any doctrine or manual. It was born from desperation, from pilots who were tired of missing, tired of dying, and willing to turn their bombers into gunships. As the Mitchell streaked away, trailing smoke from its right engine, its crew let out a single breath. They had just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, a bomber slicing a ship apart not with bombs, but with bullets. And somewhere in the distance, Japanese sailors whispered a name they'd soon come to fear, the strafing demons. What the enemy didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. Behind every blazing attack lay a story of innovation, conflict, and defiance within the U.S. ranks. Some commanders called it madness. Engineers said it would tear the plane apart. But a handful of pilots, men like Major Paul Pappy Gunn, refused to listen. They had seen too many failures, too many friends vanish into the sea. If the manuals didn't offer answers, they'd invent their own. The idea was as simple as it was insane. Load the front of a twin-engine bomber with enough firepower to shred a destroyer's deck armor, and fly it so low that a single mistake meant death. In the coming months, these gun-nosed B-25s would rip through Japanese convoys like circular saws through wood, changing forever how airpower worked over the Pacific. But before victory came the doubt, the disbelief, and the price paid in blood. Why did these men risk everything to fly such suicidal missions? Who first dared to weld machine guns into a bomber's face? And how did this reckless idea become one of the most effective low-level strike tactics of the entire war? Those answers lie not in manuals or orders, but in the smoke and fire of the Bismarck Sea, where ingenuity met desperation, and the sky itself became a weapon. Before the roar of 8 guns shattered the calm of the Pacific, the air war in the Southwest had been a slow, grinding stalemate, a cruel duel fought over jungles, coral reefs, and endless ocean. It was 1942. The Japanese Empire stretched like a steel tide across the Pacific. From the Philippines to New Guinea, they moved with precision and speed, their forces bound together by sea convoys protected by deadly fighter cover. Their pilots, men of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, were seasoned, fearless, and equipped with one of the most agile aircraft the world had ever seen, the Mitsubishi A6M-0. The Zero could twist, climb, and roll with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. In the early months of the war, American airmen learned to fear that pale green silhouette diving out of the sun. Against it, the U.S. Army Air Forces fielded P-40 Warhawks, P-39 Airacobras, and twin-engine B-25 Mitchells, rugged, but hardly elegant machines. The B-25, a medium bomber born from compromise, was never meant to duel fighters or skim waves. Its strength lay in range and payload, not speed or maneuver. Designed by North American Aviation, it could carry a decent bomb load and withstand damage. But it was still just a bomber, expected to fly in formation and drop its ordnance from altitude. And yet, in the harsh geography of the Southwest Pacific, a theater ruled by jungle storms, unpredictable weather, and low visibility, the doctrine written in Washington didn't work. The Japanese convoys moved at night, hugging coastlines and disappearing under camouflage nets by day. Traditional high-altitude bombing produced scattered hits, if any at all. In early 1943, American air commanders faced a humiliating truth. They were losing the battle for New Guinea. The Japanese supply lines were alive and strong, feeding the garrisons at Lae, Salamaua, and Wewak. The Allies, grounded by rain and frustrated by failure, were fighting an invisible war. But among the chaos, a few men refused to accept defeat. At the heart of this transformation stood Major Paul Irvin, Pappy Gunn, a former Navy pilot turned outlaw mechanic. Gunn wasn't a theorist, he was a maverick, an engineer with grease on his hands and defiance in his eyes. When his B-25 squadron at Port Moresby kept losing bombers to Zeros and flak, he didn't ask for better planes. He started redesigning the ones he had. He tore out the bombardier's glass nose and replaced it with slabs of aluminum and machine gun mounts. At first, 450 caliber guns, then 6, then 8. To him, the logic was simple. If you can't hit a ship from above, destroy it from the side. While official channels debated theoretical feasibility, Gunn's crews were welding guns into their bombers by flashlight. Mechanics scavenged gun mounts from wrecked P-40s and spare turrets. They tested the results in the most dangerous way possible, in combat. Meanwhile, far from the improvisation of Port Moresby, General George C. Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, faced impossible odds. His bombers couldn't find their targets, his fighters couldn't protect them. But when he saw what Pappy Gunn had done to a B-25, Kenney didn't reprimand him. He smiled. Here, finally, was the kind of thinking the Pacific demanded. Brutal, fast, and close to the ground. The stage was set. The enemy ruled the skies with maneuverability. The Americans would answer with raw firepower. By late February 1943, intelligence reports revealed that a massive Japanese convoy, 8 troop transports escorted by 8 destroyers, was heading toward Lae. It carried nearly 7,000 men and vital supplies for the defense of New Guinea. If the Allies couldn't stop it, New Guinea, and perhaps all of northern Australia, would be at risk. But this time the Americans weren't coming from above the clouds. They would come from the sea's surface, hidden by the glare of sunrise. Their bombers would dive through flak, skip their bombs across the water like stones, and then, when close enough to taste the salt spray, unleash streams of gunfire that would rip ships open like tin cans. The old doctrine had died. A new kind of war was about to begin. By late 1942, the Pacific sky had become a graveyard of silver wings. The Americans were flying hard, fighting harder, and losing anyway. Every mission seemed cursed. Bombers disappeared into thunderstorms, never to return. Those that survived came home riddled with holes, their gunners silent, their fuel tanks leaking, their faces ghost-white beneath oil-streaked goggles. From Port Moresby to Milne Bay, the airfields were filled with twisted wreckage, the silent proof that something was deeply wrong. The Japanese had mastered the art of survival. Their convoys moved like ghosts covered by Zero fighters launched from Rabaul, a fortress carved into the cliffs of New Britain. Rabaul wasn't just an airbase. It was a hornet's nest of bombers, fighters, and anti-aircraft batteries. Any attempt to attack the convoys near New Guinea meant flying directly into the mouth of that monster. The standard American tactic, high-altitude bombing, had failed miserably. From 10,000 feet, bombs scattered like rain over empty ocean. Visibility was poor, winds unpredictable, and Japanese ship captains learned to turn hard the moment they saw falling bombs. The results were humiliating. Hundreds of sorties, and barely a handful of direct hits. Colonel John Davies, one of Kenny's senior officers, wrote in his report, "We are losing men faster than the Japanese are losing ships. We are bleeding into the sea." The enemy, meanwhile, grew bolder. Their destroyers cruised openly near Leh, their supply convoys steaming through the Huon Gulf under cover of night. Every ship that made it through meant more Japanese troops in the jungles and more dead Allied soldiers on the ground. Morale plummeted. Crews whispered that the Pacific was a death sentence. Mechanics worked through the night to patch bullet holes, only to see the same planes fail to return the next day. And for the pilots, the horror wasn't just in the losses, it was in the futility. Lieutenant Bill Adair of the 90th Bombardment Squadron remembered one mission vividly. "We hit them from altitude, saw the bomb splash in the wake of a transport. Not a single hit. I remember thinking, we could do this for 1,000 years and never sink a damn thing." The Japanese anti-aircraft fire was deadly precise. The tropical air made smoke hang low over the water, blinding bomb sites. The cloud cover broke radar contact. Every approach felt like flying blind into a steel wall. By December 1942, the 5th Air Force had lost more aircraft in the New Guinea campaign than in all previous months combined. General Kenny was under immense pressure from Washington to produce results, to prove that the air war in the Pacific could turn the tide. But how? The planes were too slow, too heavy, the bombs too inaccurate, the doctrine outdated. It was then that Kenny turned to the misfits, the rule breakers, the innovators who didn't care about manuals or headquarters memos. Men like Pappy Gunn and the restless young pilots of the 3rd Attack Group, known unofficially as the Grim Reapers of Port Moresby. They were tired of playing by the book. When Kenny asked his pilots what they needed, one of them reportedly answered, "Give us something that can hit them before they hit us. Something that can tear their decks apart." That simple sentence carried the weight of every failed mission, every burning wreck, every telegram home that began with, "We regret to inform you." The crisis had reached its breaking point. By early 1943, the Americans were staring into a tactical abyss. The Japanese supply lines seemed unstoppable. If nothing changed, New Guinea, and perhaps the entire Southwest Pacific, would be lost. And yet in that desperation lay the seed of genius. A handful of men, mechanics, pilots, and engineers began to whisper an idea so radical that most considered it suicidal. What if the bombers stopped flying high and started flying low? What if, instead of bombing from the clouds, they attacked from wave height, guns blazing? It sounded insane. The air at that altitude was thick with flak. One mistake, and you'd clip a mast or crash into the ocean. But those who had seen too much failure were willing to risk it. Because the only thing more dangerous than changing tactics was not changing them at all. In early 1943, the smell of oil and sweat filled the air over Port Moresby. Mechanics worked by the flicker of lanterns, their hands blackened with grease and cordite. The jungle buzzed in the distance, the night broken by the rhythmic clang of hammers against aluminum. This was not standard maintenance, it was creation. Improvisation, born of desperation. At the center of it all stood Major Paul Pappy Gunn, sleeves rolled up, cigar clamped between his teeth, eyes burning with the spark of rebellion. Around him, a team of airmen stripped the glass nose off a B-25 Mitchell. The bombardier's seat was gone. In its place, metal plates were welded, and mounts for 50 caliber Browning machine guns were bolted directly to the fuselage frame. One gun, then two, then four. Gunn kept pushing. "That's not enough," he growled. "We're going to make this thing bark." By the time they were done, the nose of the aircraft bristled with 8 heavy machine guns, all forward firing, 4 fixed in the nose, 4 mounted in side pods. The result looked monstrous, brutal, and utterly unlike anything that had flown before. When General Kenny inspected the modified B-25, he didn't see madness. He saw potential. "You think it'll hold together?" he asked. Gunn grinned. "Only one way to find out." The first tests were chaotic. The recoil from the 8 guns nearly tore the plane off course. The nose shuddered under the vibration. The guns jammed, cables snapped. But Gunn's men refined the setup, reinforcing mounts, synchronizing the fire controls, and adding armor plates to protect the pilot. Finally, one clear morning, they flew it out over the water. Gunn himself took the controls. He aimed at a derelict barge near the coast and opened fire. The sound was unlike anything the Pacific had ever heard. 8 Brownings erupting in unison created a roar that shook the very sky. The barge disintegrated in seconds. Kenny watched from the ground, hands on his hips. "That," he said quietly, "is what we've been waiting for." Soon, entire squadrons of B-25s were being retrofitted. The concept spread like wildfire, across bases, across commands. The pilots called them Strafer Mitchells. The Japanese would later call them something else, the Flying Saws. But the real test came in March 1943. Intelligence intercepted a message. A massive Japanese convoy, Operation 81, was steaming from Rabaul toward Leh. 8 troop transports, 8 destroyers, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers. It was the supply lifeline that could decide the fate of New Guinea. Kenny and his staff knew this was it. If the convoy reached Leh, Japan would strengthen its grip. If it was destroyed, the Pacific balance could shift. On March 2, 1943, waves of Allied aircraft lifted off from airstrips across New Guinea, B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs, and Australian Beaufighters. The skies were thick with humidity and rain, the sea below glinting like polished steel. The Japanese convoy moved in tight formation, destroyers guarding the transports like wolves circling a flock. The air above was filled with black puffs of flak. Then, out of the low clouds, the Americans appeared. The first wave of B-25s came in low, dangerously low, barely 20 feet above the waves. Their 8-gun noses were already blazing. Tracers tore across the decks of Japanese ships, shredding gun crews and bridge structures. Pilots described the sensation as flying through hell's front door. The gunfire cleared the decks, and the following waves of B-25s dropped bombs at mast height, skipping them across the surface like stones. When they hit, the explosions were catastrophic. Destroyers tried to turn. Transports caught fire. Pilots saw sailors diving overboard, lifeboats flipping in the shockwaves. The Japanese convoy dissolved into chaos. One pilot, Lieutenant Ed Larner, later said, "We could see the ships literally coming apart under the gunfire. The nose guns sawed through them like blades. For hours, the attack continued. The air was filled with smoke, oil, and shrapnel. Despite heavy flak and fierce zero resistance, the B-25s pressed on, their new tactics working with terrifying precision. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, all 8 Japanese transports were either sunk or burning. Only a few destroyers limped away. Nearly 3,000 Japanese troops were killed in the inferno. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over, and a legend was born. The transformation of the B-25 from a conventional bomber into a low-flying, gun-nosed ship killer had changed everything. It was a triumph not just of firepower, but of imagination, of men who refused to accept defeat and built their own solution with their bare hands. For the first time, the Americans had turned the tide in the skies over the Pacific, but victory came with a cost and new challenges. The enemy was watching, learning, and adapting. The next phase of the war would test whether this miracle of ingenuity could endure the unforgiving grind of battle. The smoke from the Bismarck Sea still hung over the Pacific when the reports reached Washington. For the first time in the Southwest Pacific, an entire Japanese convoy had been annihilated, not by submarines or battleships, but by medium bombers armed with machine guns. The numbers were staggering. 12 Japanese ships sunk or burning, thousands of enemy troops lost, and not a single transport reaching its destination. General George C. Kenney's 5th Air Force had done the impossible. They'd crippled Japan's supply artery to New Guinea with just a few dozen aircraft and the courage to fly them almost at sea level. The victory stunned the Allied High Command. Newspapers back home called it the miracle of the Mitchells. But for the men who had been there, it was no miracle. It was the product of months of failure, experimentation, and sheer defiance. The B-25's transformation into a gun-nosed killer was now officially embraced. North American aviation began producing dedicated variants, the B-25G and B-25H, each one more fearsome than the last. The B-25H carried not just machine guns, but a 75mm cannon in its nose, turning it into a flying anti-ship cannon. Crews joked that it was a bomber with a battleship's heart. Tactics evolved quickly. Instead of flying high-altitude runs, the B-25s now attacked in coordinated low-level formations. The first flight would strafe the target, clearing decks and suppressing anti-aircraft fire. The second would perform skip-bombing runs, dropping bombs that bounced across the surface before detonating at the hull. The third flight often followed with rockets or more strafing to finish the job. The results were devastating. In raids on Wewak, Kavieng, and Rabaul, Japanese ships and airfields were shredded under the new technique. Pilots described the ocean itself turning black with oil and smoke. The Japanese, stunned at first, began to adapt. Their ships increased anti-aircraft armament, and convoys began sailing only at night, often hugging coastlines to avoid radar detection. But even then, the B-25 crews found ways to strike, using moonlight, radar-assisted navigation, and daring night attacks that pushed the limits of courage and sanity. For the crews, the cost was immense. Flying at 50 feet above the sea meant that a single miscalculated wave, a burst of flak, or a jammed control could end everything. Many never returned. The ocean became their grave, their aircraft swallowed by the same waters they had once turned into fire. Lieutenant Bill Anderson recalled, "You didn't think about dying. You just flew. The guns rattled, the sea blurred by, and all you could do was hold that line and pray your rounds hit first." Yet the psychological impact of these missions was enormous. Japanese sailors came to fear the sight and sound of the Mitchells. The nickname Strafing Demons spread through their ranks, whispered with dread. Commanders ordered their men to fire on any low-flying twin-engine plane immediately, no matter the risk. By late 1943, the balance in the Pacific had shifted. The Allies were advancing, island by island, cutting Japan's supply lines to pieces. The gun-nosed B-25 had played a crucial role in this transformation. It wasn't the fastest or sleekest aircraft, but it embodied a new kind of warfare, aggressive, adaptive, and ruthless. Other theaters soon took notice. Modified B-25s appeared in Burma, the Philippines, and the Central Pacific. Even the British and Australians experimented with similar concepts, inspired by the American success. Still, not every mission was a triumph. The same low-level tactics that brought victory also caused catastrophic losses when conditions went wrong. Pilots flying through rain squalls or flak often had no escape route. Several entire squadrons were nearly wiped out during over-ambitious daylight raids against heavily defended positions. But to the men who flew them, those dangers were part of the price. They believed in what they'd built, in the raw, defiant spirit of invention that had turned a medium bomber into a weapon feared across the Pacific. General Kenney would later write in his memoirs, "The Mitchell didn't win the war, but it showed us how imagination can change its course. We stopped fighting by the book and started writing our own." By the end of 1944, the Strafer B-25 had become an icon of the Pacific campaign, not just for its firepower, but for what it represented: American adaptability. The idea that when tradition failed, Innovation took its place, even if it was born in the dirt of a jungle airstrip and held together by sweat, wire, and stubbornness. The sky that had once belonged to the Zero now belonged to the Mitchell. But as the Pacific advanced toward Japan itself, a question began to linger in the minds of the men who had survived. Had their innovation made war more efficient, or simply more brutal? When the war finally ended, the Pacific grew quiet again. The sea that once boiled with fire and oil turned blue and still. The wrecks of ships, those that had been torn apart by the 8-gun noses of B-25s, sank slowly into the deep, where coral began to grow over twisted metal. For the men who had flown those missions, silence was the hardest part. Major Paul Pappy Gunn, the man who had built the first gun-nosed Mitchell, survived the war, though not without scars. His legend grew far beyond the airstrips of Port Moresby. To his crews, he wasn't just an engineer. He was proof that one man's defiance could change the course of history. Gunn continued his service after the war but died in 1957 in a plane crash, fitting, perhaps, for a man who had lived his life in the sky. General George C. Kenney, whose trust in unconventional minds made the transformation possible, would go on to command the entire U.S. Air Forces in the Pacific, and later write about those years with deep admiration for the men who made the impossible work. In his view, the strafer B-25 had done more than destroy ships. It had redefined what courage and ingenuity meant in modern warfare. The innovation that began in a jungle workshop spread far beyond its origins. The lessons learned from low-level attack missions became the foundation for post-war aircraft design. From the A-26 Invader to the A-10 Thunderbolt II, every generation of close air support craft carried a trace of the Mitchell's DNA. Heavy forward firepower, low-altitude endurance, and the philosophy that precision could come from daring as much as from technology. In museums today, visitors stand before the preserved hulks of those B-25s. Their noses, bristling with gun ports, still look menacing, even in silence. Children stare at the empty barrels, not realizing that decades ago they spat fire so fierce it sawed through steel. But beyond the metal lies something deeper. The spirit of improvisation, of men who refuse to surrender to doctrine or defeat. The B-25 story is not just about engineering. It's about willpower. It's about the belief that even in the darkest hours, human creativity can become a weapon more powerful than any gun. Veterans who flew the strafer missions rarely spoke of glory. They spoke of survival, of the blinding flashes, the smoke, the faces they never saw again. Some said the roar of 8 guns never left their dreams. Yet when asked if they would do it again, their answer was always the same. Yes, because it worked. The Japanese never fully recovered from the psychological shock of those attacks. The very sight of low-flying bombers became a symbol of Allied dominance, of an enemy that had learned, adapted, and turned desperation into doctrine. And so, the legend of the flying saws lives on, not as a story of machines, but as a testament to human audacity. War, in the end, is not only about who has the better weapon, but about who dares to imagine one that does not yet exist. When Pappy Gunn's first modified B-25 roared over the Bismarck Sea, it carried more than bullets. It carried an idea that innovation is born not from comfort, but from crisis. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the 8-gun nose, that in the moments when everything seems lost, there will always be someone, somewhere, willing to weld steel, break rules, and fly into the storm, just to prove that it can be done.